Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Blue Maxima and I'm here checking out the Ratchet and Clank trilogy. Or just one of them. Mainly because I'm only going to be playing Ratchet and Clank 3 in this because it's the easiest one to show off in terms of actual gameplay, and yeah, the other games have a couple of problems. Ratchet and Clank is fine in the typical sense, but to be fair, it is the least competent of the games, and I feel like playing just it would have a bad impression. And the problem is, I can't play Ratchet and Clank 2. There's a reason why I can't play Ratchet and Clank 2. Also, there was absolutely no audio until I went to the Ratchet and Clank 2 video for some reason. I'm going to turn that down a little. Now, there's a reason why I can't play Ratchet and Clank 2. You want to know why? Because on the retail version, which is the one I'm playing right now, there is a bug which makes the game crash on every loading transition. Loading transitions come every 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah, I do not know how they managed to pull that off. The digital version on the European and Australian PSN, absolutely fine. The retail Australian version, at the very least, every 15 minutes there's a crash. I don't know what the deal is. And that just leaves Ratchet and Clank 3, which we'll be playing. Unfortunately, there's no way to get back to the other games instead of outright just closing the game, closing back to the live area. You can't say, okay, quit Ratchet and Clank 3, go to Ratchet and Clank 2. You have to quit out of the entire thing. So we're just going to be playing Ratchet and Clank 3, because there's not much else we can do, really. Go have a look at the options real quick. They're about the same in every game. You get subtitles, sound, and language, and then you get control options. Controls in these games are a bit odd. I'll try and talk about my experiences with all three. However, I have beaten all three on the PlayStation 3 in the Ratchet and Clank HD collection as of, what was it, about 3 months ago? Something like that? I don't know. Maybe I'll get the actual Vita versions on my US account. Or whatever. I've got 2 hours in Ratchet and Clank 3. I've got an hour each into Ratchet and Clank 1 and 2. And I also have some user testimonies to work off. So I've got a fair amount of experience to work with here. Loading times are a little long, but I can forgive that. It's a cartridge game. What do you want? So, we're going to have to actually go to another area. So, Ratchet and Clank is a platform across shooter, although later on in the trilogy you get is definitely a lot more shooty than platformy. So, we're just going to go to the next planet. First thing you might notice is that these games are nowhere near as bad as Jak and Daxter. Thank Christ for that. Ratchet and Clank 1, 2, and 3 have not, in any sense of the word... Why did I go to Florana? Oh well, I can show off Florana anyway. Ratchet and Clank 1, 2, and 3 all run at a relatively solid clip. I've heard things about the frame rate dropping when you go into areas like the sewers to gain the sewer crystals. But, to be fair, that actually made the PS2 versions lag a little bit as well. So, you know, I can't really fault the game for it. We might as well just go through Florana, because why not? So in every game, you've got a selection of weapons and gadgets, and you buy new weapons and gadgets. I don't have that many, but you can see a few of the ridiculous ones here. Like, we've got a shotgun, a grenade launcher, an actual plasma whip, which I'll use. I love the plasma whip. Really good. So in these games, you shoot things and they drop experience and bolts. You use bolts to buy stuff. You use experience to get more health. In Ratchet and Clank 1, it's not like that though. In Ratchet and Clank 1, you just you only have 4 health and you can only buy more health. So that's a bit of an oddity, but you know, Ratchet and Clank 1 can be forgiven for a lot of things because it came out back when both Jak and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank were both transferring into the sort of platformer, into the platformer shooter mindset instead of just the platformer mindset. So you can forgive these games for a lot, and to be fair, they're still fun to play. There's just a fair few problems with these ports. Most of the problems I've heard about come from the sound. Sometimes the sound doesn't work properly at all. It's a bit odd. Sometimes it just refuses to work. Like on the main menu there, you saw there was no audio for Ratchet and Clank 1, and then when the video changed to Ratchet and Clank 2, it got sound all of a sudden. I don't know what that was about. So you travel throughout these worlds, smashing things, killing enemies. Surprised no enemies came through that, to tell you the truth. Might as well talk about the controls while we're here. Mostly okay. Like, Ratchet and Clank 1 actually works fine because that game didn't have that many inputs. So you end up in a situation where you are playing with the same sort of control scheme that was designed for the original game, where you're just running around and sloppily shooting at enemies, because that game didn't have strafe lock or anything, so it was a bit iffy, but they were still learning, and it was still fun to shoot things, and you didn't really need to. You could hit things with your wrench if you needed to. It was alright. Ratchet and Clank 2 goes a bit odd with this, because it requires that you hold down, like, if you've played remote play on games before, like on the PlayStation 4 or the PlayStation 3, or if you've played a PlayStation 1 Classic and you've used the rear touchpad, you'll know what I mean when I say you press in the top right corner of the rear touchpad in order to do things like strafing. In Ratchet and Clank 2, you have to hold there constantly in order to make sure that you actually strafe, which is a bit of an oddity, because you think they would just let you do it by default. But nope, they don't. You have to hold in the rear strafe all the time. Thankfully, you don't have to do it all the time, but you do have to do it a fair bit. And it's kind of annoying. But it doesn't destroy the game in any way. What does destroy the game is the fact that I can't play it without the game crashing every 10 to 15 minutes. But we'll get onto that. Ratchet and Clank 3 actually lets you set lock strafe by default, so I'm not actually holding anything in. I'll just go into the controls menu to show this off. So controls camera, so you can turn on the lock strafe mode. The problem with this is that they've mapped the L button to looking. That's wrong. They've done that completely and utterly wrong, and I'm pissed off about it. And here's why. Because back in the Ratchet and Clank 3 port on PlayStation 3, L1 was mapped to jump. So you could, it was kind of like Bumper Jumper in Halo, where you would map it to lock strafe and you'd have access to way more functions overall. And it's so annoying because in this game you actually have to press X to jump, which means you can't go from aiming to jumping and then back to aiming again in a smooth way. You're going to have to give up one of them in order to do the other. In Ratchet and Clank 3, this is a little bit of a problem, because especially when you're doing stuff like the Quark-tastic battle, where there's enemies everywhere and you need to avoid everything, you are going to be having trouble doing things like jumping and aiming at the same time. So you're going to aim and you're not going to be able to shoot something that's right next to you, and that's so annoying. Again, it doesn't break the game, but it's worth mentioning. What does break the game is the masses of issues that I've heard about each of the 3 games, most of which you're not going to see here. Most of the issues I've heard about related to the sound, like some of the sound doesn't play. The reason some of the sound doesn't play is because some of the Gadgetron stuff is actually meant for the, let's just go on the path of death. Some of the Gadgetron stuff doesn't play, some of the speech doesn't play, and that's because they've had to remap stuff to the back touchpad, like for example, crouch is remapped to the rear touch. So you have to, so they can't use the same voice clip that they used on the PlayStation 3 remaster, and they didn't record a new one for obvious reasons. So they can't do anything like, say, record a new clip, and they can't use an old clip, so there's no clip there to be seen. That's fine, right? Like, there's no reason, like, it would be nice if there was a new clip there, but I can't argue with it. It's kind of alright. Then there's things like some of the surfaces not being textured properly, and some of the texture bugs are pretty egregious sometimes. Like, slot machines in Ratchet and Clank 2 have just this white aura around them instead of a texture sometimes. It's a bit odd. But all of these glitches aren't too bad, because except for the fact that Ratchet and Clank 2 retail crashes an absolute ton for like no goddamn reason. Like, I don't know how you screw that up. How do you screw up, like, making your detail, your detail and your original? God brain, work with me today. How do you screw up your retail version when your digital version works fine? I have no clue. But yeah, when you take into account the fact that the games are 30 FPS, I've heard something about the Insomniac Museum in Ratchet 2 being broken. I don't know about 3. But when your games run at 30 FPS and don't have that many crash issues or anything like that, you're doing a ton better than Jak and Daxter did. I'm sorry. You're doing a ton better than Jak and Daxter did. That's for sure. I'm gonna go back to my ship. I'm gonna go to Annihilation Nation and do some combat, because I do quite enjoy this game's combat. Most of the gadgets work fine. From what I've played of the games, which is about an hour and a half, the first two, and 2 hours of this, everything seems to be absolutely fine, right? I don't have an issue with the way the game runs. And if you can get over the bugs, this is a perfectly serviceable version of the Ratchet and Clank Trilogy. Then again, serviceable might not be enough for you people, and I can understand why. However, this version works. It works alright. Some of the bugs are kind of weird. Like, I was playing this and, like, I've run into the same bug in this version of the game that I did on the PS3 version, where for some reason the screen just went orange during one of these challenges, and then I had to exit the match, and then I had to go back in, and it didn't happen again. And for some reason that happened on both versions of the game that I own, and it didn't happen again for some reason. I'm not sure what the deal is. But the frame rate does stay stable, at least for the amount of time that I've played the game. As I said before, the frame rate might go down in the sewers, but to be fair, with how complex the sewers are, that's perfectly fine. I can't argue with it. And the games are still fun as hell, even 10 years later at this point. They look very flashy. The ports, the graphical capabilities are fairly good. There is some pop-in at some points, but I really can't argue with it. It is it's a fun trilogy of games. They definitely get better as time goes on, especially when it comes to something along the lines of like Ratchet 1, where it's a bit 2001 design, we'll put it that way. It was changing between a shooter and a platformer that kind of tripped Insomniac up on this. But thankfully it's still a fun game to play through, and it's still got this sort of gunplay element to it, although it's not as good as the rest of the games. I wish they included Gladiator, but then again, Gladiator might have been screwed up just as badly too. You know, it might have crashed after every mission, who knows. But it's not that bad of a trilogy. It's definitely better than Jak and Daxter. I'll give it that. Jak and Daxter was an outright disaster. Those games were unplayable because the controls were so bad. I'm thankful that these games came out as well as they did, and maybe they'll actually decide to patch these ones, especially since they're going to have to for the retail version. Maybe they'll actually patch some of the more obscure bugs out. Whether or not you should buy it is a question that'll leave yourself to answer. Do you want to wait and see whether or not the ports will get any sort of patching to make them better? Or do you want to just, you know, avoid it because you think, oh, 30 FPS and a bunch of bugs isn't good enough for me? 30 FPS is perfectly fine to play Ratchet and Clank, by the way. I am perfectly capable of playing this just the way it usually is played. I don't have an issue with it in the slightest. So yeah, I guess it's up to you. Are you willing to deal with a admittedly slightly cut down version of the game with a bunch of bugs and 30 frames per second instead of 60 in order to play it on the go? If you answer yes, this is probably for you. Pick it up when it comes up on the digital store, although you may want to wait to make sure that the bugs don't get reported for the retail versions as well. I still can't believe they did that. How the hell do you pull that off? For those of you who don't think it's worth the drops in detail, drops in frame rate, and the bugs to play, then don't pick this up. It's serviceable at best. And that's pretty much all I've got to say about it. I'm going to stop commentating and just play this boss fight. I'll see you all next time.
Audience member in seat number 326.